Hello everyone, and welcome to another Cut Rate Commander Precon Upgrade Guide, the series in which we take a look at Precon decks and bring them up to cut rate standards. My name is Grazzet, and today we're going to be looking at the Bedecked Broker's Precon from Streets of New Capenna and its face commander, Perrie the Pulverizer, which we'll be bringing up from its roughly $40 price points to an increased budget of $75 after upgrades. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Perrie the Pulverizer is a 3/3 Rhino soldier that costs 1, a green, a white, and a blue with the following abilities. When Perrie enters the battlefield, put a shield counter on target creature. Whenever Perrie attacks, target creature you control gains trample and +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of different kinds of counters among permanents you control. Breaking down his core stats, Perrie possesses a mid-size CMC, a below-average stat block for his cost, and a pair of abilities that let him distribute a shield counter to himself or another creature, and then use that counter along with any others we control to provide a powerful stat buff with trample every time he swings in. Taking a look at his first ability, it provides Perrie with some solid defense as soon as he comes down, as we'll usually be electing him to put the shield counter on. This allows him to survive the first destruction-based removal thrown his way, which is a solid deterrent in the first place since our opponents don't want to waste their removal, making him quite a resilient creature from the get-go. This then pairs nicely with his second ability, which grants Perrie or another creature of our choice a substantial stat boost and trample depending on the number of unique counters we have in play. Again, like the previous ability, we'll usually be targeting Perrie himself with this to more easily allow him to close out games through commander damage, granting himself +1/+1 in trample if it's only his shield counter on board, but becoming much better once we start stacking different counter types, whether they be common counters like +1/+1 in charge counters, less common keyword counters, or even rarer counters such as brick and lore counters. With each one we acquire, turning our commander into a bigger and bigger threat until he can 1-2 shot our opponents. So, as we can see, Perrie's all about getting different types of counters into play to power himself up and crack in for damage, which is why in this Precon upgrade we'll be augmenting the core build to do just that, loading up the field with plenty of sources of unique counters to turn our commander into a juggernaut and gain value from doing so. Looking at our sources of counters first, luckily the core build already has a solid selection of them built right in, so we'll be building upon those to add even more unique counter types to power up our commander, as well as beefing up the quality of the counter distribution sources we already have, ensuring that they have powerful effects that fit the game plan instead of just serving as another counter type. And with so many counters being generated, we'll be adding to the payoffs from the base build in order to take further advantage of them, ranging from sources of proliferate and proliferate-like effects to ensure we can get even more counters on board, means to move those counters or give copies of those counters to other creatures to spread their benefits around, and even ways to use up spare counters for additional value to fuel our game plan even further. So let's see what this X-Boxer turned Enforcer for the Brokers can do. He may not be the best looking rocks around or read so good, but he more than makes up for his downsides with raw strength, toughness, and loyalty. And with giant gavel in hand, he'll be dispensing justice on the streets of New Capenna on behalf of the Brokers, one cracked skull at a time. So now that we have a better understanding of the commander and playstyle, let's take a look at the cards we'll be keeping from the base build. Starting off with our creature base, we'll be keeping the best counter-creating specimens from the core build to ensure that Perrie has plenty of options to power himself up. Devoted Druid, Incubation Druid, and Wall of Roots, for example, all stay in for not only being solid sources of ramp, but also giving us access to -1/-1, +1/+1, and even -0/-1 counters for Perrie to use, while they help us speed up our mana base. Scavenging Ooze and Steelbane Hydra also get to keep their spots, again providing us with easy access to +1/+1 counters, while either serving as solid Graveyard Hate or back row removal respectively, that get even bigger over time thanks to the number of proliferation sources we have access to. Wickerbow Elder also stays in as another source of back row removal as well as -1/-1 counters, being a rare instance where we actually want to proliferate the -1/-1 counter on it if possible to get extra uses out of its removal. Forgotten Ancient makes the grade as well, its ability to produce and distribute +1/+1 counters as we and our opponents cast our spells being invaluable, either to power up Perrie or spread the love across all our creatures depending on what our board state looks like. Then rounding out the primary sources of +1/+1 counters from the core build, we'll be keeping Rishkarpima Renegade, Fathom Mage, and Skyboom Evangelist, all of which can easily get +1/+1 counters on themselves and or others, as well as being potent payoffs for them in the form of ramp, card draw, and evasion, with the latter even granting flying to any creature we control with any type of counter, not being limited to just +1/+1s. Moving on to some creatures with more uncommon counter distribution, the keyword counter distributors Wingspan Mentor, Slippery Bog Bonder, and Avenging Hunt Bonder all make it into the final build. The ability ability they have to grant Perrie or any one of our other creatures permanent flying, hexproof, and double strike, being incredibly powerful buffs to ensure that they can get in for damage, live through removal, and double their damage output. In a similar vein, Denry Klein, Editor-in-Chief, stays in by being a great source of +1/+1 first strike or vigilance counters as our creatures come into play, and, if we can get other counter types on him, gets even better by distributing those counters as well, making him a powerful counter payoff as well as a counter distributor. The walking keyword counter production source, Crystalline Giant, will be staying in as well. The combination of 10 different counter types it's able to give itself over its lifetime, not only making it a dangerous threat that gets even more dangerous as time passes, but also giving our commander a maximum +10/+10 boost all on its own, which is fairly impressive and doable if we can drop it early enough and get it to stick. And for our most unique counter distributor so far, Aven Mimeomancer makes it in as a unique and repeatable source of feather counters that not only grants our creatures flying, but also gives them an offensive base stat change, making our mana dorks and utility creatures into decent size evasive threats if needed. Pivoting away from counter generators and now focusing on counter payoffs, the proliferate sources consisting of Grateful Apparition, Thrumming Bird, and Parkite's Maverick all make the final cut, as offensive sources of counter multiplying with built-in evasion to get us extra +1/+1 counters, shield counters, charge counters, and any other type of counters that would benefit from having multiples of, as does Evolution Sage for proliferating on landfall instead, which can be safer if we have no good attacks. Similarly, Skyship Plunderer and Vorel of the Hullclad keep their spots by letting us stack counters on a single target more effectively, working particularly well with Perrie to give him more +1/+1 and shield counters to make him stronger and more durable, as does Aven Courier, who instead distributes counters in play to other creatures, making it a superb way to distribute some of our more valuable but rare counters such as Hexproof and Indestructible to targets beyond the first. Angelic Sleuth will also stay in, its ability to turn our modified permanents into eventual card draw through clues being nice upside, being particularly useful if we've had to endure a wipe to help us get the resources we need to rebuild our board state. And finally, our last creature holdover will be Bribe Taker, who at worst is a 6/6 Trampler, which is not a terrible rate for a 6-drop, but at its best can be a massive beatstick with an impressive assortment of keyword, +1/+1 and other counter types that can give even our commander a run for his money, making it a good fallback plan if our commander becomes indisposed himself. Moving on to our instant keepers, we'll start off by holding on to the better removal options that the core build has to offer, with Banned Charm and Broker's Charm staying in as solid backrow removal options, creature/walker removal, and either giving us a situational counter spell or draw as needed, and Generous Gift keeping its spot as well by being a staple removal option that deals with a wide variety of threats with minimal downside. Being part removal and part utility, Broker's Confluence hangs on to its spot as well despite its high cost, primarily for allowing us to proliferate phase creatures out and counter abilities up to 3 times. The proliferate working well with our counter-focused game plan, the phase out being able to be used defensively to protect our creatures or offensively to disrupt our opponents, and the counter, while situational, can go a long way to stop powerful ETB effects that would otherwise close out games. And for our last removal-based instant, Storm of Forms makes it in as a pseudo-cyclonic rift to help us clear the board of the biggest threats as we prepare to swing in for lethal, easily allowing us to bounce 5+ cards at instant speed on even minimally set up boards for only 4 mana. Then closing out our instant holdovers, Contractual Safeguard makes it into the final build by providing our whole board with the most powerful keyword counter we have in play, or at worst a shield counter, which is still a decent source of protection to have. Quickly running down the sorceries that made the cut, Tezzeret's Gambit makes it in as effectively a 3-mana draw 2 with Proliferate, which is a fantastic rate for card advantage and counter synergies. Damning Verdict of course keeps its spot for being a one-sided wipe in this counter-heavy build, ensuring the majority of our creatures remain standing after the dust settles. And finally, Rishkar's Expertise stays on as our final sorcery carryover, easily reloading our hand on our second main after Perrie pumps himself, and even getting us a free spell from hand as a bonus to help empty it. Then looking at the enchantments that carried over from the core build, Together Forever makes it in as a serviceable ETB source of +1/+1 counters that then adds an extra layer of protection to all our modified creatures by returning them to our hand upon death. Family's Favor is a decent way to get shield counters on our creatures, then turn those counters into card advantage, which works particularly well with on-damage proliferate effects to have the proliferate resolve first and have the target keep a shield counter to use later. And Resourceful Defense makes the grade as our final enchantment's carryover. Its Ozolith-like effect ensuring our counters don't go to waste if their owners are dealt with, and even giving us the option to move those counters around if needed for some extra flexibility. Proceeding to the artifacts that made the final build, the Mana Rock Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, and Belwar Stone all make the grade as excellent sources of ramp and or fixing to help grow our mana base, as do Everflowing Chalice and Midnight Clock, which do the same with the added benefit of being counter-focused to power up Perrie and take advantage of our proliferation sources, the former to ramp us even harder and the latter to reload our hands even faster. The counter-distributing artifacts that consist of Agent's Toolkit and Oblivion Stone also get to stay in, the former allowing us to hand out a variety of solid counters to our creatures, which we can proliferate on it to hand out even more, and even replaces itself once we use it up, and the latter being a wipe that, while slow, does let us save some of our permanents before we crack it while powering up our commander further as a source of fate counters. Then we close out our kept artifacts with a pair of equipment, those being Gavel of the Righteous and Swiftfoot Boots, the former being quite terrifying when equipped to our commander to give him an ever-growing stat boost and eventually double strike, which when combined with his own attack pump allows him to easily win games through raw commander damage, and the latter beefing up our commander's defenses even further to make him even harder for our opponents to interact with, while also granting him haste to allow him to swing in as soon as he comes down. Then, with no walkers to go over from our core build, we'll move straight to our land base, where Command Tower and Seaside Citadel both stay in since they can tap for any of our colors in this tricolor build. Skycloud Expanse, Sungrass Prairie, and Flooded Grove all keep their spots since they provide us with some solid filtering to help fix our colors. Canopy Vista, Prairie Stream, Fortified Village, and Port Town all make the cut since they can tap for 2 of our colors and we're running enough basics to make sure they can come into play untapped. Exotic Orchard stays in, since it can usually find us the mana we need off our opponent's land since we're in 3 colors. Vivid Creek, Vivid Grove, and Vivid Meadow all keep their spots for coming into play with charge counters and helping us fix our mana when needed, and Myriad Landscape stays in for the ramp it provides our build from the land slot. Gavany Township, Nesting Grounds, and Karn's Bastion also get to keep their spots, their abilities to distribute, move, and proliferate our counters being very useful in this counter-heavy build. And finally, all 5 plains, 4 islands, and 5 forests make it in from the core build as well. That leaves us with a final tally of 78 cards including basic lands we'll be keeping from the base build, leaving us with 22 cards to upgrade. So now that we've covered all the cards that made the cut from the core build, let's move on to the upgrades. Starting off with our creature upgrades, we'll be aiming to refine our creature base with better sources of counter distribution and payoffs. Luminarch Aspirant, for example, will be cut here for being a tad bit too slow with its counter distribution, and be replaced with Intrepid Adversary, who gives us easy access to another unique counter type with its Valor counters, and also pumps our entire board based on the number it has, making it even better once we start proliferating them. Shield Broker also gets the axe here, its theft removal being nice but ultimately too costly for this build, so we'll be replacing it with Faithbound Judge, who gives us access to judgment counters, serves as a decent evasive beat stick that can come online quickly in this build, and can even give us a form of player elimination if the game goes long enough thanks to its Disturb, which is nice to have in our back pocket just in case. The Legends Janara Asura of War and Rawless Apex Hybrid also fail to make it in, both of their counter generation being a bit too slow for us, and are instead replaced with Plaxcaster Frogling and Sporeback Troll, whose graft lets them spread their tokens to our other creatures more easily and take better advantage of our proliferation effects, while also providing protection from targeted removal or destruction for those creatures as well. And finally, Crow's Defense Contractor, who is powerful but would be better off helming a build of his own, gets exchanged out for Sanctuary Warden, who's not only a big evasive beatstick with built-in protection thanks to its shield counters, but also lets us turn our spare counters into card advantage and extra bodies, which both helps keep our hands full and grow our board throughout the course of the game. Moving on to our instant changes, we'll be upping our arsenal of removal spells by swapping out Exotic Pets, whose token creation is cute but not enough of a payoff for us, Declaration in Stone, which is both slow and only really good against token builds, and Urban Evolution, whose draw and ramp are nice but a bit too mana hungry for us, in favor of Beast Within, Swords to Plowshares, and Path to Exile, all of which are all-star removal options to efficiently and cheaply deal with threats that would otherwise interrupt or stall our game plan. Then proceeding to our Lone Sorcery upgrade, the somewhat off-theme Wipe Planar Outburst will be replaced with the more on-brand Promise of Loyalty instead, which both serves as a non-destruction based wipe that protects us from the surviving creatures, and also gives us access to Vow counters to power up Perrie, which is appreciated. Continuing on to our new enchantment additions, Hoofprints of the Stag Slow token creation will be swapped out for Bounty of Luxa, whose card advantage and ramp are better for us while still giving us access to a unique counter type in the form of Flood counters. Primal Empathy's somewhat unreliable draw and slow counter distribution gets cut in favor of Broker's Ascendancy, which spreads counters much faster to our entire board and also takes up our Planeswalkers, more on those later. And finally, Ash Barrens and its mediocre fixing will be replaced with Kalani Heart Expedition, which gives us even more cheap ramp and fixing while also adding a source of quest counters to the build for yet another way to pump up our commander. Then reaching our artifact upgrades, the Slow Power Conduit and Oracle's Vault, along with Bent Panorama and its forgettable fixing, all get cut in favor of Tome of Legends, Sunset Pyramid, and Investigator's Journal, all of which give us access to unique counters in the form of Page, Brick, and Suspect counters, hit the board relatively early, and give us access to solid and repeatable card advantage throughout the course of the game that we can easily keep reloading with our Proliferate and Proliferate-like effects. And for our last artifact swap, the vanilla Commander Sphere will be exchanged out for Replicating Ring instead, which is much more on brand by providing us access to night counters, and eventually turning into 8 mana rocks for a huge amount of ramp, which again we can speed up thanks to our proliferation sources. Then arriving at our Planeswalker upgrades, a Johnny Unyielding will be swapped out for being a bit too slow and not focused on counters enough, along with the Slow-Fetch Broker's Hideout, to make room for the counter Juggernauts Elspeth Resplendent and Vivian Monster's Advocate, both of whom give us access to a plethora of counters to power up our commander, card advantage with their abilities and or passives, and can even get us extra bodies on board to build up our board state, making them well worth their cost in this build. And finally reaching our land changes, we'll be swapping out the more copy-focused Ajara Mirror-like for Tyrite Sanctum instead to give our build access to the ever-elusive Indestructible counter, and then speed up our mana base by swapping out Temple of Mystery, Path of Ancestry, and Llanowar Reborn, and exchanging them for Yavimaya Coast, an island, and a forest instead as our last changes to our mana base. So now that we've covered all 22 cards which we'll be upgrading from the core build, let's take a look at the breakdown for this Precon upgrade. This deck currently has 31 creatures including the commander, 9 instants, 4 sorceries, 6 enchantments, 13 artifacts, 2 planeswalkers, and 35 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have a total of 29 unique types of counters, 17 sources of specifically +1/+1 counters, 24 cards that care about counters or creatures with counters on them, 7 sources of proliferate, and 6 other sources of counter redistribution and multiplication outside of proliferate, giving us a generous amount of counter types to power up our commander, alongside good old-fashioned +1/+1 counters to make him and the rest of our board stronger, plenty of payoffs for said counters alongside ways to redistribute them and multiply them to spread them even further. For general deck stats, we have 12 ramp sources, 14 card draw sources, 10 targeted removal sources, and 3 board wipes, leaving us with a fairly typical number of core stats. Looking at our mana curve, we have 1 0-drop, 3 1-drops, 19 2-drops, 22 3-drops, 10 4-drops, 7 5-drops, and 3 6-drops. Our curve being fairly aggressive to drop multiple sources of counters onto the board early, followed up by our commander to begin slamming into our opponents ASAP as we continue to both power him and the rest of our board up with even more counter distribution. The final price of the deck then comes out to be $75.69 after upgrades. This price does not include tax and assumes that the price you paid for the Precon was $40. The price of the cards was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For additional upgrades, Spar's Headquarters is a solid land to help us fix our mana or be cycled away instead if we'd rather have the draw. Falco Spara Pact Weaver and Kodama of the West Tree both take advantage of our modified creatures by granting us card advantage and ramp respectively, and the Ozolith gives us yet another way to keep and redistribute our hard-earned counters in the event that the creatures that have them are dealt with. And finally, it wouldn't be a green deck without the inclusion of the Great Henge, which can come into play for only 2 mana after Perrie's Pump, ramps us, heals us, distributes counters for us, and generates card advantage for us. Just about the only thing it can't do for us is pay for itself, so we'll need to fork over the $50 to add it to the build ourselves. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Firstly, I'd like to thank all of you for the overwhelmingly positive response to the Precon upgrades this time around. I've been working quite hard to get the format down just right, and it's great to see that you folks seem to be enjoying it. And on that note, I'd like to thank every single one of the channel subs for helping us crack the 4K milestone. Thank you all for your continued support, as I'm sure you know, this channel wouldn't have gotten to this point without it. So, with the last of the Precons and their face commanders covered, it's time to tackle some of the commanders outside of those. Starting with the winner of last week's poll, the Beamtown Bullies. So look forward to a very nasty gift build featuring them next week. Then switching gears to this week's poll, let's give some of the weirdly costed commanders from the base set a chance on the ballot. That means this week's contenders will be Evelyn the Covetous, Agnes the Dragon's Lash, and Rigo Streetwise Mentor. Please cast your votes in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments which commanders from Streets of New Capenna you'd like to see in future polls. But before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel cannot grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I make these videos, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.